Hi everyone, in this series of videos we're going to be taking a look at hierarchies in Maya. The term hierarchy is used to describe the connected relationship between two different objects or even attributes of objects. Things like position, rotation, scale, that kind of thing are attributes. So what it allows us to do is link objects together and then have one object drive the attributes of the connected object. Now in this video we're going to take a look at parenting. Parenting is sort of the most rudimentary basic level of hierarchy within a lot of different 3D software packages, Maya included. So let's take a look at how parenting works and where you can access those options from. So with parenting, what we need to have is at least two objects. So I'm just going to select my polysphere tool just here, and I'm just going to create a couple of spheres for now. So I've got my two spheres here, and what I want to do, I'm just going to make one of these bigger than the other. And I'm going to place that in the middle of the grid by zeroing out all the translate values like this. And then I'm going to have this smaller sphere just sort of sitting. I might center that and then move it out to the side using the move tool, which I've got active over here. So something like this. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is parent one of these objects onto the other. So I'm going to select the smaller sphere in this case, and I'm going to hold down shift, and I'm going to then select the larger sphere like that. Now you can see when you select objects in Maya, if you select one object it'll be green, and if you select more than one object, one of the objects will be white and one of them will be green. The way that this works is the most recent or the last object that you select will be the green one. Okay, and that's how you sort of can tell which object was selected last. The reason that that's important is that in some instances Maya will need to have a particular object selected first or last before you apply things like these hierarchy options that we have. The green object is usually the last one that you've selected, and that would be the same if I've got multiple objects in here, like another 3 or 4. The final object that's selected would be green. Okay, so what I want to do is parent the child object here, which is the first one, onto the parent object, which is the last one that was selected. So I'm going to pop up to the edit menu, and then I'm going to come right down near the bottom, and I've got parent just here. The shortcut for that is P. Now, what I can do is pop into the option box here and see if there's any options that are relevant. What we have here is parent method move objects, add instance, and then preserve position. So the main one that we want to talk about here is preserve position. So when that's active, if I hit the parent button, it will link the child object, which is the first one I selected, onto the parent, which is the last one I selected. But it will preserve the position of both objects. So what happens is this child object should stay where it is. So what I'm going to do is apply that just so we can see that occurring. So when I hit apply, it connects the two, and you can see then it reselects the child object, and you can see that the child object stayed where it is. Now if I select the parent object, it will also keep the child object highlighted or selected. So what that's showing me is when both of them are green like this, it's showing me that they're both parented, okay, or this one is parented to here. Okay, now before I show you what the parenting does, what I'm going to do is undo that connection by coming up to, I'm going to select the child object again, I'm going to go to edit and unparent, which is shift P. So keep in mind that although this looks like a capital P, it's actually just P. This one here is shift P. So when I hit shift P, it should unparent this object. Okay. Now, if I select what was the parent object, you'll notice that the child object now deselects, and that means it's not connected anymore. Now that's actually quite tricky to recognize until you've sort of gotten used to it, you've got a little bit more experience. I will show you another way of visually seeing the connection. But before I do that, I want to show you the preserve position option switched off. So I'm going to reselect my child object, what is to be my child object. I'm going to hold down Shift and select what I want to be the parent object. Once again, we've got that green and white highlighting there. Then what I'm going to do is turn off preserve position, and then I'm going to hit apply to parent them. Okay. Now you'll see what's happened there is the child object is now taking on essentially the same sort of proportions or the same scale as the parent option. Okay. Now the reason for that is when I made the two spheres originally, they were both the same size. They were both quite small. And what I did was I scaled the parent object up. I just used the scale tool here and just made it bigger. And I can see that by selecting the parent object and having a look in the channel box. I can see that my scale X, Y, and Z values are roughly 2.6. That's because I made the sphere bigger. Okay, and that was something I did after I created the sphere. It was a modification rather than making the sphere that size to begin with. So what's happening is this object is controlling this object. Okay, and the way that it's doing it is it's essentially transferring these values onto this sphere. Okay, so basically what's happening is because this parent sphere has a 2.6 scale value, it's basically applying that onto this sphere here. But it's not doing it in a way where this child sphere's values change, because we haven't manually changed anything on this sphere. All we've done is parented it onto this one. Okay, so it can be a little bit tricky to work out or to keep track of things like these values. Okay. Now the reason that this sphere jumped out so far, because it was sort of here originally, the reason it's jumped out is it's basically doubled the it's sort of taken its original translation and also then its next translation. Also, something that could have caused that is because this is scaled up, it's scaling from the position of this sphere. So as it scales up, it's scaling from the middle of this sphere, and therefore it's getting bigger and it's pushing out like this. That could also be a reason why it's jumped out to there. So let's see what happens if we reset the scale values. For now, I'm just going to turn this back on and then close the panel. So if I take my parent object, and you can see that anything I do with the parent object as far as moving, rotating, and scaling will also transfer to the child object. So if I move the parent object, you can see that the child object moves with it. If I select the child by itself and I move that, you can see that it will move by itself. So you can still independently animate or reposition or scale or rotate the child, but anything you do to the parent will transfer also to the child. So they are linked in that respect. So they're linked from this one to this one, not from this one back to this one. Okay. So if I take the parent, you can see here I can rotate it and it's going to make the child go with it. I can also scale it. I can scale it up and down, and you can see that the child object is going to match the parent in whatever I do. Now let's take this scale value and drop it back down to its original position, which is 1. Scale is always by default a value of 1. And you can see now that it drops back down to the original position. Now, this is roughly where the little sphere was before I parented it. And so it is that scale value that has increased that's actually forced this sphere out into a position over here. Because as this scales up, basically the distance is scaling as well between the two. It's a bit of a weird concept, but that's roughly the easiest way of explaining it. Okay, so let's unparent this again. So with the object selected, I'm going to go to Edit, Unparent, like that, Shift P. I'm going to take this one and scale it back up roughly to where it was. Actually, I'm going to do something a little different. Instead of scaling it here, I'm going to actually kind of change the structure of the model. I'm going to scale the structure up rather than just the general object itself. So in order to do that, I'm going to right click and select vertex mode like this. I'm going to grab the scale tool. I've selected all the vertices in the object, and I'm just going to scale it up roughly to about twice the size. So this is roughly where it was before. I'll just right click and go back to object mode. Now you'll see that this object, if we go back over to the scale in the channel box, you can see that the values are still 1. Okay, so when you select an object like this, if you just scale it like this, it will change this value. But if you go into the object's components by right clicking and selecting one of these component modes, so either edge, vertex or face, what you're doing is actually changing the structure. You're changing the position of these points, these little dots. And that's independent of the object as a whole when we're in object mode. So object mode is sort of like an invisible container around the object structure. So when you make that bigger and smaller, what you're seeing is those numbers change here. If you go into the structure of the object, you're then dealing with the actual object itself. So when you scale that up and down, it's not reflected in these values. Okay, so I'm going to reparent this. So I'm going to hold down, select my first child object, grab my sphere, and I'm just going to go back to Edit, Parent Options, Preserve Position is still switched off, and I'm going to hit Apply. You'll see now that the sphere stays exactly where it is. And that's because the parent object's scale was at at 1, at its default. So that's sort of a little bit of an explanation of, some of the side effects that parenting can have. Okay, so I'm going to turn preserve motion back on. I'm just going to hit undo, which is here, or under edit, undo. Or it's Control Z or just Z by itself on the keyboard. Okay. Now I've got to do that a couple of times. There we go. Yep. So they're disconnected now. And I've just reset this. You can always reset these panels by going most of the time to Edit, Reset Settings, and it'll give you the defaults. And I'm just going to select Child and Parent, and then parent them. Okay, so what that's going to do is give me, this kind of connection. If I rotate the parent, the child will rotate with it. If I select a child, I can rotate that, and the parent won't rotate at all. If I click this little button at the top here, just here, this is wireframe on shaded. If I click that, it's going to put these blue outlines over the top of my object. What I can do is rotate the child, and you can see that the parent is not rotating with it. Like that. So parenting is sort of one of the simplest ways of connecting objects together. So it allows you to, for example, have, let's say, some kind of machine part that might be made up of multiple pieces. You can parent some of those pieces together. So when one of the parts moves, the rest of them move with it and they don't fall out of place. But you can still independently animate or move or rotate or scale those individual pieces that are parented to the main structure. So that's sort of probably one of the most basic ways of rigging simple objects together. So to give you a quick demonstration of that, what I'm going to do is just put together a very quick object. And this is not meant to represent anything at all. It's basically just a few shapes. So let's do something like that. So I'm just duplicating a few of these, and I'm going to pop them onto here like this. And I might make just a small cube. And do something like that. Okay. So let's say this is sort of our machine. Okay. The big block is sort of the main piece. Okay. And what I want is for these things to sort of move independently of this, you know, in a particular fashion, but all of these pieces still, you know, remain together if I move this around. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of my objects, and I want the parent object to be selected last. So the parent object is this main box, this big box. So to ensure that that's selected last, I'm going to hold down Shift and click on it. That deselects it. You can see that this cylinder is the final selection at the moment. If I hold Shift and then click it again, now the main box goes green, which means these things are all going to get parented to it. So if I now go Edit, Parent, they are now all connected to the main box. So if I select the main box, you can see that they go green. And if I move this box around, you can see that they go with it. I can rotate it like that, okay? So all of that's working fine. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some basic keyframes here just to get these objects moving around a little bit. So I'm going to start off with this one, this cube on the top. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this to 25 frames for this animation. Oops. There we go. That way it's about a second long, and it's going to be pretty simple to deal with. So if I go to there and I type in 359, oops, 359. There we go. What that's going to do, if I keyframe that, that is now going to give me this rotation of that cube. Okay. Now with these ones, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a keyframe. I'm going to grab these two and I'm going to move them up like this. Then I'm going to go to the end, I'm going to keyframe that, and I'm just going to change the position of these. Oops, kind of reverse them. So now what I should get is these two switching around as well. Okay. So now if I grab the parent object and I keyframe that, what I can do is jump to the end here. I'll type in, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate that to there, and then I'm going to come to the end and I'm going to rotate it to there. I don't want it to go all the way around because you won't see it moving if it's backwards. Okay. And I'm also just going to set that. And then halfway through the animation, so it should be about there roughly, I'm going to move it up a little bit. So it should move. And you can see that the up and down and twisting movement on the main block is working. And you can see that because those other smaller pieces are parented to it, they're also going to share those translations and rotations from the main box. But they're also doing their own animation as well. So the little box on top is twisting, and you can see that the cylinders on the sides are going up and down. So that's a little bit about parenting. As I said, it's the most simplistic way of connecting objects together to form very small basic hierarchies that you can use to do simple animations. I'll see you in the next video.